This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. The 1960s were a decade defined by exploration, both earthly and cosmic. As the world watched the space race unfold between the US and the Soviet Union, public fascination with what lay beyond Earth's atmosphere reached new heights. Science fiction was booming in popular culture, fueled by TV shows like The Twilight Zone and Star Trek, which speculated on humanity's place in the universe. Amid this excitement, a growing number of reports of unidentified flying objects, or UFOs, began to capture the public imagination. From mysterious lights in the sky to strange encounters with alien beings, UFO sightings seemed to be on the rise, and with them came both wonder and fear. The 1960s became a pivotal decade for UFO culture, as incidents like the Betty and Barney Hill abduction in 1961 made headlines, convincing many that we were not alone in this universe. It was against this backdrop of UFO fervor that Stefan Michalak's strange encounter at Falcon Lake occurred in 1967. His story, marked by physical injuries and unexplained phenomena, added another layer to the growing belief that something unknown was visiting our world. While UFO enthusiasts saw Michalak's case as proof of extraterrestrial contact, skeptics scrambled to find more grounded explanations. Still, in a decade where the line between science fiction and reality seemed increasingly blurred, Michalak's experience stood out as one of the most compelling and puzzling UFO encounters of its time. This is the story of the Falcon Lake incident. Stefan Michalak's experience, now known as the Falcon Lake incident, began like any other Saturday for him on May 20th, 1967. As a mechanic and amateur prospector with a passion for nature, Michalak was exploring the area around Falcon Lake, located in southeastern Manitoba, hoping to find mineral deposits. Armed with little more than a few tools, a notebook, and his prospector's hammer, he wandered through the dense woods until he reached a rocky outcrop, a common spot for prospecting. Around noon, as Michalak was chipping at a vein of quartz, he was startled by a flock of geese. The birds, which had been calmly settled near the lake, suddenly erupted into loud honking and took off as if frightened by something. Startled by their reaction, Michalak looked up into the sky to see what had spooked them. At first, he did not see anything unusual, but moments later, two objects caught his eye. Hovering in the sky, they appeared to be oval or cigar-shaped, glowing with a reddish-orange hue. Stephen would later describe them as two cigarette-shaped crafts floating silently, almost as if they were observing the landscape. After watching them for several seconds, one of the objects changed course and sped off into the distance, vanishing from sight. The other craft, however, began to descend toward the rocky outcrop where Stephen stood. He watched in awe as the object slowly landed about 160 feet away from him, balancing perfectly on the uneven terrain. Initially confused but driven by curiosity, Stephen cautiously approached the landed craft. As he neared it, he observed that the object was about 35 feet in diameter, shaped like a classic flying saucer with a domed top. The surface was smooth, metallic, and highly reflective, resembling polished stainless steel. It gleamed brightly under the midday sun. Michalak could hear a faint humming sound emanating from the object, and there was a distinct smell of sulfur in the air. As a practical man with no strong belief in UFOs, Stephen assumed it might be a secret military vehicle. His mind raced with possibilities. Was this a US experimental aircraft? A Soviet device, perhaps? He shouted out to whoever might be inside, calling in English, then in Polish, his native tongue, and even Russian, hoping to communicate with the occupants. but his calls were met with silence. Despite the lack of response, Stephen continued to study the object. As he walked around it, he noticed what appeared to be an open door or hatch on one side of the craft. Bright lights, too intense for him to see clearly, streamed from the interior, casting a glow on the rocks around him. He could hear something inside, like the sounds of machinery or faint voices, but he could not make out any clear details. His instincts warned him to be cautious, but curiosity overcame him. He moved closer, standing just a few feet away from the glowing opening door. From his vantage point, Michalak could see strange patterns inside, but the intense light made it impossible for him to discern much more than that. Growing a little bit bolder, Stephen reached out to touch the craft. The surface felt smooth and strangely warm, almost hot. To his shock, the fingertips of his rubber gloves melted on contact with the object's surface, as though it were radiating intense heat. Startled, he pulled his hand back, realizing that the craft was no ordinary metal machine. Suddenly, without warning, the door or hatch slammed shut with a quiet hiss. As Stephen stared at the seamless hull of the ship, he noticed a grid of small holes or vents on the side of the craft, directly in front of him. Without any forewarning, the vents expelled a blast of hot gas, which struck him square in the chest. The force of the blast sent him sprawling backward, and immediately he began to feel intense pain radiating through his body. His shirt and undershirt caught fire, and as he frantically tore them off, he realized that the scorching gas had left a distinct grid-like burn pattern on his torso. Dazed and now growing nauseous, Stephen struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The air now smelled even more strongly of sulfur, and the humming sound of the craft intensified. Before he could fully regain his senses, the object lifted off of the ground with a sudden upward motion. It hovered for a brief moment, its smooth metallic surface reflecting the surrounding forest and sky, before shooting off into the distance at a speed faster than anything Stephen had ever seen. Alone now, Stephen Michalak's body throbbed with pain. His chest felt like it was on fire where the blast had struck him, and he could feel waves of nausea overwhelming him. He looked down to see a perfect grid of burn marks seared into his skin, an exact match to the pattern of the vent holes he had seen on the craft. Gasping for air, he retched and vomited onto the rocky ground. His legs felt weak, and his head spun with dizziness. Realizing he needed immediate medical help, Stephen staggered away from the landing site. He found his way back to the campsite where he had left his gear earlier that day. Though his body felt like it was shutting down, he managed to gather his belongings and began the difficult trek through the dense forest back to the highway. The walk was agonizing for him, each step sending shooting pains through his body as the nausea ebbed and flowed. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the road and flagged down a passing driver who, seeing his disheveled and pained state, quickly drove him to the nearest town. At the hospital in Kenora, Ontario, doctors examined Stephen Michalak's burns, and he explained his encounter with the strange aircraft. He was weak, dehydrated, and disoriented. The burns on his chest were particularly baffling to the medical staff. They weren't typical of anything they'd ever seen, and the precise grid-like pattern was puzzling. In addition to the burns, Stephen was experiencing severe nausea, vomiting, and headaches. Over the next few days, his condition worsened. His body seemed to be rejecting food, and his nausea became a constant, unrelenting problem. Stephen's skin broke out in rashes, and he began to suffer from periods of fainting and confusion. Though he tried to explain what had happened to him, many of those who heard his story were skeptical. But despite the surreal nature of his experience, Stephen stuck to his account with unwavering consistency, adamant that what he had encountered was not a hallucination or a dream of any kind, but a real, tangible event. As the sun set on May 20th, 1967, Stephen Michalak lay in a hospital bed, his body racked with pain and confusion. The burns on his chest would remain with him as a permanent reminder of his strange and terrifying encounter near Falcon Lake. While he did not know what he had experienced, Stephen was sure of one thing. Whatever he had seen and touched on that rocky outcrop was like nothing he had ever encountered before. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment. The immediate fallout from Stefan Michalak's encounter at Falcon Lake was one of widespread curiosity, skepticism, and intense investigation. Stephen's story, bizarre as it was, attracted attention both locally and nationally. What made his account compelling wasn't just the strange details, but the physical evidence, the burns on his chest, his illness, and the corroborating physical findings at the site that suggested something extraordinary had occurred. As a result, what started as a local mystery quickly evolved into one of Canada's most well-documented UFO cases. Upon being treated at the hospital in Kenora for his burns and illnesses, Stefan Michalak began telling his story to both medical professionals and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP. His initial description of a strange flying craft and subsequent injury caused by its close proximity sparked immediate disbelief among some who heard it. However, due to the severity of his physical condition, he was taken seriously enough that further investigation seemed warranted. Stephen's story was soon picked up by local press in Manitoba. News of his encounter made headlines, drawing significant attention from UFO enthusiasts, skeptics, and government authorities alike. Newspapers ran headlines about the Falcon Lake UFO incident, and Stephen's burns became an iconic part of the story. Some viewed Stefan Michalak's story as a potential hoax or even a hallucination, while others speculated that it could have been the result of a classified military experiment gone wrong. Locally, reactions were mixed. Some people in the Falcon Lake area were skeptical, dismissing Stephen's encounter as a case of a prospector spending too much time in the sun or encountering some other natural phenomenon. Others, intrigued by the mystery, believed that there could have been truth to his claims, particularly due to his reputation as a sober, reliable, and practical man. Many who knew him found it hard to believe that he would fabricate such an outlandish story, especially since he seemed genuinely traumatized by the event. As word spread about the incident, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police became involved in the investigation. Officers from the RCMP met with Stephen shortly after his hospital visit, where he provided them with a detailed account of the incident itself. Despite the fantastical nature of his claims, the RCMP treated the case seriously, particularly due to Stephen's physical injuries and the growing public interest. In the days following the incident, the RCMP sent officers to the Falcon Lake site where Stephen said the encounter took place. When they arrived, they found the rocky outcrop, as Stefan Michalak described it, including a circular burn mark about 15 feet in diameter where Stephen said the craft had landed. What perplexed investigators even further was that parts of the rock near the burn circle were radioactive. The RCMP, while unable to explain Stephen's story, documented their findings and relayed them to the proper authorities. Given the potential national security implications of a foreign or unidentified craft, the Royal Canadian Air Force, the RCAF, launched its own investigation. RCAF personnel visited the site to assess the possibility of the object being an experimental military craft, either Canadian, American, or perhaps even Soviet. However, their findings remained inconclusive. While they acknowledged the physical evidence of the site, radioactive material and the burn marks on the rock, they could not determine the source of the radiation or explain Stefan Michalak's burns beyond a shadow of a doubt. The area was cordoned off for further testing, and the RCAF recommended more rigorous follow-ups on Stephen's story. The media, always hungry for sensational stories, eagerly followed Stefan Michalak's case. Newspapers across Canada, and even in the United States, ran stories about the Falcon Lake UFO incident. Headlines like, "Man claims UFO burned him," or "Canadian prospector injured by mysterious craft," became common as journalists flocked to this sparsely populated area of Manitoba. Stefan Michalak himself, while not seeking the spotlight, cooperated with reporters and investigators alike. He gave interviews, though he repeatedly stressed that he wasn't claiming to have seen extraterrestrials or flying saucers. He stuck to the facts of what he had experienced: the strange object, the intense heat, the blast of air or gas that burned him, and the subsequent physical illness he endured. Stephen was adamant that he was simply recounting what had happened, without embellishing or conjecture. His stoic and matter-of-fact demeanor only added to his credibility. Despite this, Stephen also faced intense scrutiny. Skeptics, both in the press and the general public, questioned his motives. Some suggested he had fabricated the entire story for attention or financial gain, though Stephen consistently denied this, pointing out that the incident had only caused him harm, physically, emotionally, and financially. His family, including his son, later recounted how the media attention and doubters created stress and chaos in their lives. Michalak himself had no desire to turn this encounter into a spectacle, but was forced into the public eye because of the nature of his incident. Beyond the government and the media, the incident also drew the attention of scientists and UFO investigators. UFO research organizations in both Canada and the US took an interest in the case, interviewing Stephen and visiting the site. These groups were often divided in their assessments. Some UFO researchers believed that Stephen's case was one of the most credible UFO encounters due to the physical evidence. The burns, the radioactive material found at the site, and Stephen's consistent testimony. Others were more skeptical, suggesting that Stefan Michalak had either hallucinated or encountered something terrestrial that may have been misinterpreted, such as a natural gas vent or a malfunctioning piece of military technology. One of the most puzzling aspects for investigators was the radiation found at the site. While the burn mark on the ground could be explained by some kind of natural fire or chemical reaction, the presence of radioactive material was harder to dismiss. Scientists conducted tests on Stefan Michalak's clothing, which also showed traces of radiation, further complicating the investigation. However, the exact source of this radiation could not be definitively linked to any known technology or natural phenomena in the area. In the weeks following the incident, Stefan Michalak continued to suffer from severe health problems. His burns took a long time to heal, and the mysterious grid-like pattern remained visible on his skin for months. He suffered from ongoing nausea, headaches, weight loss, and periods of blackouts or fainting. Doctors who examined him were baffled by his symptoms. The burns on his chest did not match any known medical conditions or injuries caused by common heat sources, such as fire or chemical burns, and the recurring nature of his symptoms made them even more mysterious. As Stephen dealt with the physical and emotional fallout of the incident, his story remained a topic of national conversation. UFO enthusiasts hailed him as a credible witness, while skeptics pointed to the lack of clear, undeniable evidence of extraterrestrial involvement. Despite the swirling controversy, Stephen stuck to his story, never changing or embellishing the fact. He continued to maintain that he did not know what the object was, but he was certain that it was not anything he had ever encountered before. In the immediate aftermath of the Falcon Lake incident, Stefan Michalak's life was thrown into turmoil. His strange and traumatic encounter drew the attention of government authorities, the media, and the scientific community. While investigations by the RCMP, the RCAF, and various researchers failed to provide a clear explanation for what had happened, the physical evidence, burns, radiation, and Stephen's deteriorating health, gave credence to his account. Stephen became an unwilling participant in a national mystery, one that would continue to spark debate and intrigue for years to come. Despite the ridicule and scrutiny, Stephen's steadfast commitment to the story he told ensured that the Falcon Lake incident would remain one of the most compelling and credible UFO cases in history. We'll be right back after another quick break. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police was one of the first agencies to respond to Stefan Michalak's claims. Initially, they treated the incident with skepticism, suspecting that it might have been a hoax or a misinterpretation of natural phenomena. However, when RCMP officers interviewed Stefan Michalak, they found him to be rational, sincere, and consistent in his retelling of events. His physical condition, especially the strange grid-like burns on his chest, also lent credibility to his account. The RCMP sent officers to the site where Stefan Michalak claimed the craft had landed. At the location, they found a 15-foot wide burn mark on the ground, precisely as Stephen had described. Further tests revealed the presence of radiation at the site, although the source of the radiation was unclear. Investigators took soil samples, which were later analyzed and confirmed to contain radioactive material. This finding intrigued the RCMP, but also deepened the mystery, as there was no obvious explanation for the radiation in the area. Despite their efforts, the RCMP could not definitively explain what had happened and left the case open, listing it as unsolved. The Royal Canadian Air Force became involved shortly after the RCMP. Given the Cold War tensions at the time, there were concerns that Stephen might have encountered a secret military aircraft, either from the US or the Soviet Union. The RCAF sent personnel to investigate both Stephen's claims and the landing site. While the RCAF was thorough in its examination, their findings were ultimately inconclusive. They found no evidence of any aircraft or technology known to be in operation at the time that could explain this encounter. The burns on Stephen's body and the radiation at the site remained perplexing to RCAF officials. They did consider the possibility of an experimental craft or a military exercise gone wrong, but no evidence supporting this theory ever emerged. Without concrete proof, the RCAF closed their investigation without a definitive conclusion. Given the international attention the case garnered, the US Air Force also took an interest in Stephen Michalak's story. Through their UFO investigative program, Project Blue Book, US officials conducted interviews and reviewed the findings from both the RCMP and the RCAF. However, like their Canadian counterparts, Project Blue Book investigators could not determine the nature of the craft Stephen Michalak described. They acknowledged that the physical evidence, particularly the burns and the radiation, was unusual, but without more concrete evidence, they listed the case as unsolved. Project Blue Book closed in 1969, leaving the Falcon Lake incident as one of the few cases with significant physical evidence that remained unresolved. Stephen's deteriorating health became a focal point of the investigation. In the weeks following the incident, Stephen experienced severe nausea, headaches, weight loss, and recurring fainting spells. As I mentioned earlier, doctors who examined him were baffled by his symptoms. The burn marks on his chest, which matched the grid pattern of the vent on the craft, did not resemble typical thermal burns or those caused by chemicals. The persistence of Stephen's symptoms over time added to the mystery. Some medical experts speculated that Stephen had been exposed to a type of radiation that was not commonly encountered, possibly an industrial or military-grade source. However, no definitive cause for his symptoms was ever identified. Despite extensive medical examinations, Stephen's condition slowly improved, but he continued to suffer from lingering health issues for years after the incident. In the years that followed, numerous theories emerged to explain what Stephen Michalak had experienced on that fateful day back in 1967. While no single explanation has been universally accepted, a few common theories have persisted. 1. A UFO or extraterrestrial craft. Many UFO researchers believe that Stephen Michalak had a genuine encounter with an alien craft. The physical evidence, burns, radiation, and the landing site, aligned with other UFO sightings and encounters reported around the world. Stephen Michalak's consistent retelling of his experience, along with his refusal to claim he saw aliens, lent credibility to this theory. To this day, some view the Falcon Lake incident as one of the most compelling UFO encounters on record. 2. Classified military aircraft. Skeptics have proposed that Stephen may have encountered a secret military aircraft, either Canadian or American, that was being tested in the remote wilderness of Manitoba. During the Cold War, experimental aircraft were often tested in isolated areas such as this. However, no military records have ever surfaced to support this theory, and both the Canadian and US governments denied having any aircraft in the area at the time of this incident. 3. Natural phenomenon. Another theory suggests that Stephen may have stumbled upon a natural gas vent or some other geological phenomenon. Some skeptics propose that Stephen could have inhaled toxic gases, which caused him to hallucinate the encounter. However, this theory doesn't really explain the burns on his chest or the radiation found at the site. It also fails to account for the detailed description Stephen provided of the craft itself. 4. Hoax or fabrication. A small group of skeptics have suggested that Stephen could have fabricated the entire story. They argue that he may have injured himself in a prospector's accident and created the UFO narrative to gain attention or financial compensation. However, Stephen consistently rejected these claims and says that he refused to capitalize on his experience. His reluctance to turn the incident into a commercial venture makes the hoax theory less plausible. Stephen Michalak never wavered in his account of what happened at Falcon Lake. Until his death in 1999, he maintained that he had encountered an unknown craft of some kind, though he never claimed it was extraterrestrial in origin. Stephen Michalak's son, Stan, later took up his father's cause, working with UFO researchers to further investigate the case. In 2017, on the 50th anniversary of the incident, Stan Michalak co-authored a book, When They Appeared, detailing his father's experience and the subsequent investigations. The Falcon Lake incident remains one of the most well-documented UFO cases in history. The physical evidence, particularly the radiation and the burns on Stephen's body, has puzzled experts for decades. Despite numerous investigations by both Canadian and US authorities, no definitive explanation has ever been provided. Stephen's story stands as a compelling and unresolved mystery, with many considering it to be one of the most credible UFO encounters ever reported. Over half a century later, the Falcon Lake incident continues to captivate those who study UFO phenomena. Stephen Michalak's experience, bolstered by physical evidence and thorough investigation, remains a case without any clear answers. Was it a secret military craft? Or a geological anomaly? Or perhaps was it something not of this world? The answers have eluded investigators for decades, and as the years pass, the incident's mysterious nature only deepens. Stephen Michalak himself could never provide an explanation beyond what he had experienced, leaving future generations to ponder the strange events of that day. And for that reason, the Falcon Lake incident will remain a tantalizing mystery lost in the wilderness of Manitoba, forever unresolved. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm sorry this episode took so long to come out. As I mentioned in some of the prior episodes, I'm in the process of moving down to Texas at the moment, and I'm actually recording this episode at an Airbnb in Washington while I visit with some family on the way down. Before I recorded it though, the computer that I'm using decided it did not want to work, causing me a bunch of headaches that I don't need. But now, things seem to be working just fine, and I'm hoping to record the next episode, the Season 9 finale, right after this. But anyhow, thanks again for everything. The Season 9 finale should be out incredibly soon, and we'll have a quick turnaround before starting our 10th season, which, wow. When I started this podcast on a whim back in 2015, I never once thought we would get there. But until then, I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye everyone.